Hello, I'm Davon Norris. I'm an LSA Collegiate Fellow and Assistant Professor of Organizational Studies here at the University of Michigan. I study the ways credit and debt shape patterns of inequality, where I especially attend to issues of racial inequality and racism. I've mostly done this by centering the credit ratings and credit scores that determine who gets what in credit markets. While most know that people have credit scores, fewer know that state and city governments have their own credit ratings that function in a similar way. So my main research digs into the history, construction, operation, and consequence of both of these measures of creditworthiness to better understand their relationship to inequality. My current research is twofold. First, with a group of collaborators, we're using new proprietary credit report data to better understand the distribution of consumer credit and debt and trends over time. Like wealth inequality research more broadly, research on credit and debt is limited by a dearth of data. We're working with this new proprietary data set to try and fill key gaps in our current knowledge. Second, I am analyzing the history of consumer credit scoring to explain what I think is a curious shift in US politics. Whereas policy during the early advent of consumer credit scoring in the 1970s was focused on reducing the data that went into credit scores because of their concern of promoting racial exclusion, recent policy efforts have been oriented towards expanding the data used in credit scores as a way to promote racial inclusion. So the second line of work is trying to make sense of that puzzling shift and its consequences. I am biased, but I think studying credit and debt is one of the most important things to study. Besides it being key to understanding wealth inequality, debt binds disparate parts of society together. We can see this in its most pernicious forms with the financial crisis, as mortgage defaults from predatory loans in one part of the country ripple through the entire economy. Or the image behind me that shows a bond the state of California sold to investors in the 1860s to finance war expeditions against indigenous peoples, which ultimately entangled regular families in an overt mechanism of dispossession. But we can see the importance of debt every day in our infrastructure, schools, homes, and parks. So much of what literally structures our lives is made possible because someone or some institution borrowed some amount of money. If we understand credit and debt, then I think we better understand the interconnectedness of society and gain a better sense of how and where we can make improvements. So typically when researchers or policymakers even discuss debt, they're thinking about the debts that are relatively more common amongst advantaged and frequently white populations. Things like mortgages, student loans, and credit cards. There is less attention to the debts that are relatively more common amongst disadvantaged and racially marginalized populations, like legal fines and fees, payday loans, and the things I am increasingly interested in, which are past due bills like water bills. So in future work, I'm going to be focusing on water and water debt in large part because it enables me to bridge my research on city government debt with consumer debt, as water provision is often done by a municipal government. That means the creditor for a past due water bill is the city itself. And when you consider the cities borrow billions of dollars to maintain and construct water and sewer infrastructure, then we begin to see how tightly locked in a particular kind of debt relationship cities and their residents are. That water provision is increasingly challenging in a context of climate change means that it is a uniquely interesting and vital context to study and explore. When I think about the problems of inequality and debt, I think about and wonder, well, what do people borrow money for? They borrow money for their homes, they borrow money for their transportation, they borrow to finance their education, they increasingly go into debt because of their need to access quality healthcare. So I think a way forward is figuring out alternative pathways that don't always require people to borrow money to access the important goods they need for their lives.